going to roll next to talking about flood insurance. If you're, if this is something that affects you, there's a lot of change that's happened, and it's important, I think, if you're looking at getting a mortgage, to know all the different costs. We had, Bob Enriquez from the Hillsborough County Property Appraiser's Office on last week talking about property taxes and, how to estimate them and how to determine your assessments and escrows, and flood insurance is a cost that I think oftentimes gets overlooked by customers looking to buy a property. They look at everything else, and then maybe they get a quote from a lender, and the lender doesn't know it's in a flood zone, and then ipso facto, the extra flood insurance cost is going to cause problems. So, but there's a lot of changes happening with flood insurance, that I've seen, and wanted to give you a chance, Richard, to kind of educate the listeners on, stuff that's happening with flood insurance that's different than the way it has been.
Well, and a lot of those changes are actually good changes. It used to be that if you wound up in a flood zone and your lender required you to buy flood insurance, you had one choice and one choice only on where to go to buy that. And it was through FEMA. You still dealt with your local agent, the same person who sold you your homeowner's insurance could sell you the flood insurance. But it was, here's the price, take it or leave it. If you
and it was based purely on elevation.
It was
right?
based purely on elevation.
Elevation of the property. That's
right. And if you wanted that house, you didn't have a choice in the matter. You had to buy it if you had a mortgage, because the mortgage company would require it, which would make sense.
Right.
But now it's becoming a little bit more like standard homeowners insurance, in the fact that there are other players jumping into the market. Nowadays, when somebody calls us and they are looking at buying a house and it's in a flood zone, sure, we still give the standard FEMA quote, like we always did in the past, but if that doesn't look good, then we have 3 other companies that we can also check and try to give a competitive quote by going through them. And those don't necessarily just look at elevation. They look at a lot of history of the place.
I've been waiting for that forever.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you may live in an active area according to FEMA, and it may be below the floodplain, but maybe it didn't flood there in the last 50 years. So it might behoove them to take that into consideration.
And that's what I always thought. It was kind of like, if you compare it to other types of insurance. So like for example, flood, basing it only on elevation. And no other factors. You know what I mean? It's just, like if you had a car, for example, and you had the same car as someone else, it would be like basing everyone's insurance based on the car. Like we're only going to factor that in, not the house, not the elevation, or the elevation obviously, but not the location, not the flood history, and I've seen it sometimes where you've got a house that's on a lake. Like a lake is in the backyard. Like you can see the lake.
Right.
But the elevation is apparently high enough that it doesn't need flood insurance. And it's like, if it gets a rain, that thing's going to flood. Like you need flood. I don't care if they tell you need it or not. You need it, And so it just didn't make sense to me how they based it purely on elevation. And I'm glad to hear that they're making that change, because proximity to bodies of water, all those types of things come into play. And I've seen customers go out and buy a home close to a body of water, but the elevation was high enough, so they didn't have to have it, so they didn't get it because they had a mortgage, and then guess what happens? The house floods, and then they find out it floods all the time, know, and it's like, okay, well, that's something that gets tracked. There's data on that. They can figure that out to determine, how someone should be insured. So I'm really glad that that's happening, because it's much needed.
Absolutely. Before I was in the insurance business, I lived on a lake, and I didn't have flood insurance because my mortgage broker told me I didn't need flood insurance, so I didn't buy it.
Right.
So I didn't know any better.
Yeah, and I see that happen a lot, and it always baffled me that it was based purely on elevation, and so I'm really glad that's changing, because there's a lot of other factors. There are areas of Tampa that flood consistently, but they're above apparently a certain zone, so they don't have flood insurance. And there's areas that are below it that never flood, but flood insurance is astronomically high because of how far above sea level they are.
Yeah, we used to see when we were quoting, and FEMA was the only option. Whenever we saw Tarpon Springs, we would kind of go, "Oh no."
You just know it's going to
this is going to be a ridiculous rate, and we saw rates in Tarpon Springs of $3,000 and $4,000 and $5,000, and now we're going back and telling those customers, let us requote you again, and we're requoting them again, and we're seeing prices much lower with these.
So any other, so obviously anyone out there that has a property in Tarpon Springs is paying flood insurance should be on the horn with you guys and saying, hey, get us a new quote. Any other cities out there or areas of town that you're seeing that same thing in?
Tarpon Springs is big. Port Richey, we used to see Port Richey and Port Richey.
Okay.
We used to see a lot of
Probably closer to the coast, is generally more closer to the coast, because
Right.
it seems like the elevation kind of drops as it gets closer.
Yeah, absolutely. Those are all what are considered low-lying areas, but they don't get a lot of floods.
Yeah.
So those aftermarket
Awesome.
companies are really, wanting
Pricing
their
well,
business.
terrific. We're going to be back continuing the conversation after a quick break here on the Duncan Duo Show.